The year was 1872, and winter was a killer. It stalked the frontier like a hungry wolf, its breath a frozen wind that rattled bones and broke spirits. It buried the world in a great white shroud, and under that shroud, Millie Harper was watching her children die. She crouched at a lonely crossroads, a place where two wagon ruts met and vanished into the snow. Her son, Eli, was 8 years old, his jaw locked so tight she was afraid his teeth would crack. He was trying to fight the cold with pure stubbornness. He was losing. Her daughter, June, only 6, was curled against her, humming a song with no tune, a ghost of a melody against the howl of the wind. And little Sammy, just 3, slept in her arms, a sleep so still and shallow it looked terrifyingly like the end. Millie had been a wife. She'd had a home with a warm oven and the smell of baking bread. But that life was gone, stripped away piece by piece, until only this remained, the gnawing in her own belly and the 3 small heartbeats she was failing to protect. The snow drove down, sharp and mean. It filled the cracks in their worn-out shoes. It dusted her hair like a crown of frost. She whispered a prayer into the storm, the same words she'd offered at the back doors of every respectable house in town. "I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook. I can clean. Just give me work. And a roof for my young'uns." Her voice was a thread. The wind tore it to pieces. That morning, the town had turned its back on her for the last time. Clarabelle, the innkeeper with eyes like chips of flint, had looked Millie up and down. She'd seen the beauty that hadn't quite been starved out of Millie's face, and her own lips had tightened into a sneer. "We've no need for the likes of you," she'd said, loud enough for the men at the bar to hear. Their laughter had chased Millie back into the blizzard. The sheriff had been just as cold. He'd stood on his porch, told her to keep moving, that the town wasn't a charity. He hadn't met her eyes. Pride was a bitter meal, but it was all they had left to eat. Now, at the crossroads, Millie knew pride wouldn't keep them alive through the night. She pictured their small bodies growing stiff, the snow covering them gently, and the thought was a knife twisting in her gut. She pulled them closer, rocking, humming, trying to make her own warmth enough. It wasn't. It would never be enough. Then, through the wind, came a sound. The groan of wood, the snort of horses. A wagon was coming. Hope was a dangerous, stupid thing. She'd learned that lesson well, but she lifted her head anyway. The wagon stopped. The man on the driver's seat didn't move for a long moment. He just sat there, a silhouette against the endless white, staring. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, his face hidden by a thick beard dusted with snow. He looked less like a savior and more like a force of nature, as cold and unforgiving as the storm itself. Millie's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't salvation. This was something else. She just didn't know what. David McGraw had heard the woman's broken song on the wind. He'd thought it was a ghost. He almost drove right past. But then he saw them. A smudge of grey against the snow, a mother and her children huddled together at the place where the roads parted. He pulled his team to a halt, the leather reins cold in his gloved hands. He hadn't felt much of anything in 2 years. Not since the fever had stolen his wife, taking her from him in a single brutal week. His house was just a place he slept. His life was a routine of chores and silence. Pity was a feeling he thought he'd buried right alongside her. Yet, as the woman looked up, her face raw and her eyes rimmed with red, something stirred deep inside him. She didn't beg. She didn't cry out. She just met his gaze with a look of fierce, desperate pride, as if she were daring him to deny she was human. Then the smallest child whimpered, a sound that cut through the wind and straight into the hollow space in David's chest. He climbed down from the wagon. He was a tall man, and the snow crunched under his boots as he walked toward them. He didn't say a word. He just shrugged off his heavy wool coat and, without asking permission, draped it over the children. Millie flinched, startled by the sudden warmth and the scent of pine smoke and leather. "Got room in the wagon," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "My ranch is a mile from here. There's a fire." She hesitated. The world had taught her that nothing was free. "We have no coin to pay." "I didn't ask for coin." Still, she couldn't bring herself to trust it. Kindness from a stranger was a story she'd stopped believing in. But then June shivered, a violent tremor that shook her whole body, and Eli looked at her with an unspoken plea that shattered her resolve. She gave a single sharp nod. David lifted Sammy first, settling the sleeping boy on the wagon seat. He offered a hand to the others. Eli pulled back for a second, his small shoulders stiff with pride, but David's steady gaze seemed to calm him. Soon they were all aboard, huddled under rough blankets. Millie climbed up last. She didn't thank him, not yet. Gratitude felt like a debt, and she already owed the world too much. The wagon creaked forward, cutting fresh tracks in the deep snow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and the rhythmic plodding of the horses. Millie studied the man beside her. His profile was grim, like something carved from granite, but his hands on the reins were steady and sure. He guided the horses with a quiet patience that seemed at odds with his hard exterior. She wondered what kind of ghosts haunted his silence. Finally, the ranch came into view. It was a large house, dark and imposing against the pale sky, with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It looked more like a fortress than a home. But a fortress was exactly what she needed. A place to keep the winter out. David helped them down and led them inside. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and old sorrows. Shadows clung to the corners of the big, sparsely furnished rooms. Millie didn't wait for an invitation. She went straight to the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life, adding logs with a focused urgency. Her hands shook, not from the cold anymore, but from the desperate need to create warmth. "You've done this before," David observed. It was the first thing he'd said since the crossroads. "A fire's the difference between living and dying," she answered without looking at him. "Learned that young." He just nodded. He brought out a loaf of hard bread and a slab of salt pork, setting them on the table without ceremony. Millie sliced the food, warming it by the growing fire. The children ate with a silent, ravenous intensity. Later, when they were asleep on quilts near the hearth, Millie sat with her hands clasped in her lap. The skin over her knuckles was split and raw. The warmth of the house was a strange comfort, but it came with a new kind of chill. The heavy weight of a debt she could never repay. She could feel his eyes on her. "I'll work," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll cook, mop the floors, mend your clothes, whatever you need. Just don't turn us out in the morning." David leaned against the stone mantelpiece, his face a mask of gold and shadow in the firelight. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. "You'll do what you can," he said finally. "That's enough." It wasn't kindness. It wasn't a promise. It was just a statement of fact. But as he spoke, he gestured with his chin toward a dark hallway. "Your children can sleep by the fire. You'll take the room at the end of the hall." He paused and his eyes grew colder. "But there's one door you don't open, the one next to yours. That room is not for you. You don't go in there. Ever." The warning hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Millie stared down the dark hallway at the two closed doors. One offered shelter, the other held a secret. And she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that she had traded the simple danger of the storm for a much more complicated one inside these walls. Morning came, pale and fragile. Millie was up before dawn, her body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. She moved silently through the quiet house, reviving the fire, putting a pot of cornmeal on to cook. Survival had taught her to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. But this house was different. It didn't feel like she was trespassing. It felt empty, a space waiting to be filled. David came in from the barn, his boots caked with snow, his beard glittering with ice. He didn't speak, just gave a curt nod as he saw her working. But his gaze lingered on the children, still asleep by the fire. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes as he watched their chests rise and fall in the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. In the days that followed, a strange, unspoken routine began to form. Millie cooked and cleaned, stretching David's meager supplies with a skill born of long practice. David worked the ranch, his movements economical and tireless. They moved around each other like two planets in a silent orbit, their paths crossing in the narrow hallway or by the warmth of the fire. Words were rare, a quiet thank you for a hot meal, a simple woods low in the evening. But their silences grew less jagged. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and for a brief second, they would see the same exhaustion, the same deep-seated grief reflected in each other. It wasn't friendship. It was the recognition of two survivors. The children began to heal. The haunted look slowly faded from their eyes. Eli, watchful and serious, began to shadow David in the barn, his initial suspicion giving way to a grudging respect. June discovered the chickens and would sing to them softly as she gathered eggs. Little Sammy would toddle after David, his tiny hand sometimes reaching out to clutch the rough denim of the rancher's trousers. Millie watched this transformation with a heart full of cautious hope. She had thought her children were broken. But here, in this silent house with this silent man, they were slowly starting to mend. But a secret like theirs couldn't stay hidden for long. Whispers started in town, carried on the wind like poison seeds. Clarabelle, the innkeeper, was the one doing the sowing. Found herself a new man already. She'd sneer to anyone who would listen. That Millie Harper knows which side her bread is buttered on. A pretty face is all it takes. The gossip found its way back to Millie on a rare trip to the general store. She felt the stares, the cold, judging eyes that dismissed her as a charity case at best, a conniving woman at worst. She held her head high, but every whisper felt like a stone being thrown at her. She had only wanted to keep her children from freezing to death. Why was that a sin? One afternoon, looking for a spare blanket in a dusty linen closet, Millie found something else. Tucked away at the back of a shelf was a small leather-bound book. A journal. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation of the fragile peace she had found, but her hands moved on their own. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It was a woman's journal, David's wife. Her name was Eleanor. Millie's heart pounded as she read. The entries were full of love for David, descriptions of building their life on the ranch. But then the tone began to change. Eleanor wrote of loneliness, of David's long silences, of a growing distance between them. Then Millie's blood ran cold. She read an entry from 3 years ago, a full year before David had said his wife died. "David frightens me sometimes," Eleanor had written. "His temper is a storm that comes from nowhere. Today he broke a chair. He did not touch me. But the look in his eyes, he says this land is all he has. I think sometimes he would do anything to protect it. Anything at all." Millie slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. This wasn't a house of grief. It was a house of fear. The man who had saved her children was not the quiet, grieving widower he pretended to be. He was a man with a hidden rage, and she and her children were trapped under his roof, miles from anyone who could help. Millie put the journal back, her mind racing. Every quiet moment, every shared silence with David now seemed sinister. Was his quietness grief, or was it the calm before a storm? She watched him now with new eyes, searching for the anger Eleanor had written about. She didn't have to wait long. A few days later, a fence broke in the west pasture. One of the cattle, their only source of milk, had wandered off into the snow-covered hills. David's face, when he discovered it, was a thundercloud. He didn't yell, he didn't curse. He went unnervingly still. He grabbed his rifle from above the mantelpiece. "Stay in the house," he ordered, his voice flat and hard. "Don't let the children out." He was gone for hours. Millie paced the floor, the words from the journal echoing in her head. His temper is a storm that comes from nowhere. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The house grew colder. Finally, she saw him returning, a dark figure trudging through the dusk. He was dragging the cow behind him. It was limping, but alive. Relief washed over Millie, so potent it made her dizzy. But when David entered the house, the relief vanished. His face was grim, his eyes dark with a frustration that seemed to curdle into something worse. He leaned the rifle against the wall and turned to face her. "The fence was cut," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Someone cut it with wire snips." Millie stared at him, confused. Who would do that? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flash of what Eleanor had described. A cold, hard suspicion. "That's what I've been wondering," he said slowly. "Strange things start happening right after I take in a family of strangers." The accusation hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. He thought she, or maybe Eli, had done it. He thought they were trying to sabotage him. "We would never," she whispered, horrified. "You saved us." "Did I?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Or did I just invite the fox into the henhouse?" He took a step toward her, his large frame seeming to fill the entire room. "This land is all I have left. I won't let anyone take it from me." Before Millie could respond, a sudden fierce blizzard slammed into the valley. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow began to hammer against the windows, not just falling, but attacking the house. In minutes, the world outside was gone, erased by a wall of churning white. David's anger seemed to evaporate, replaced by a grim urgency. He barred the door, stuffed rags into the cracks around the window frames. The storm was a physical assault, a wild beast trying to break its way in. They were trapped. Trapped in the house, trapped with the dwindling food supply, and Millie was trapped with a man she now believed was capable of terrible violence. A man who suspected her of trying to ruin him. The fire in the hearth seemed to shrink, its warmth no match for the icy fear that was closing around her heart. The storm raged for 3 days, a relentless assault that shook the very foundations of the house. Snow piled up against the doors and windows, sealing them in a white tomb. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the ranch house, and the air inside grew thick with tension. Food became the new enemy. Millie stretched their supplies with desperate ingenuity, but the pile of firewood shrank just as fast. The cold began to creep back into the house, a constant nagging presence. Millie gave most of her own meager portions to the children, a sacrifice David noticed but said nothing about. The silence between them was a heavy, suffocating blanket. His suspicion was a ghost that sat at the table with them during every meal. Millie's fear was a constant companion. She slept in snatches, her ears straining for any sound in the night, her mind replaying the words from Eleanor's journal. She watched David, looking for the telltale signs of his temper, but he was just a block of granite, silent and unmoving. His stillness was somehow more terrifying than rage. On the 3rd night of the storm, the wind moaned through a crack in the chimney, a sound like a soul in torment. Millie couldn't sleep. She slipped out of her room, drawn to the dying embers of the fire. As she passed the forbidden door, she froze. She heard something, a sound from inside the locked room. It was faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind. A soft, rhythmic creaking. The sound of a rocking chair, moving back and forth, back and forth. Millie's blood turned to ice. She was the only one awake. The children were asleep by the hearth. David was in his room at the far end of the house. Yet from behind the forbidden door came the undeniable sound of someone in a rocking chair. She pressed her ear to the cold wood. The creaking continued, slow and steady, a sound of patient, unending grief. She backed away from the door, a scream lodged in her throat. The house wasn't just haunted by memories, it was haunted by something else, something that was still here. The storm broke on the 4th morning. The silence that followed was as deafening as the wind had been. Sunlight, pale and weak, filtered through the snow-caked windows. The world was reborn, pristine and white, but the pristine beauty did nothing to calm the terror in Millie's heart. She had to know. She found David in the barn, checking on the livestock. She walked right up to him, her fear making her bold. "Last night," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I heard something. From the locked room. A rocking chair." David stopped what he was doing. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the wall of the barn, his shoulders slumped. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, scraped clean of all emotion. "It was my daughter's room," he said. "Her name was Sarah." He swallowed hard. "The fever didn't just take my wife, it took my little girl, too. She was 5. The truth hit Millie like a physical blow. The locked room wasn't hiding a dark secret of violence. It was a shrine, a tomb of grief he couldn't bear to open. "The rocking chair," he continued, his voice cracking. "Sometimes the wind catches the floorboards just right. Makes it move. Or maybe." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He finally turned to look at her, and the cold suspicion was gone from his eyes. All she saw was a pain so vast and deep, it mirrored her own. "The house hasn't been empty since they died," he whispered. "It's been full. Full of them." In that moment, they weren't a suspicious rancher and a desperate drifter. They were just a man who had lost his family and a woman who was terrified of losing hers. A fragile thread of understanding stretched between them, woven from shared loss, but just as that thread appeared, it was snapped. A loud, insistent banging echoed from the front of the house. It was impossible. The snow was waist-deep. No one could have gotten through. David grabbed his rifle. Millie ran to the window, wiping away the frost. Her heart leapt into her throat. Through the snow, she saw a horse and a man on the porch. It was Sheriff Hayes, and he did not look like he was there for a friendly visit. Sheriff Hayes stomped the snow from his boots on the porch, his face ruddy from the cold and something else, a grim determination. David let him in, the rifle held loosely at his side, a silent warning. "McGrath," the sheriff said, his eyes flicking from David to Millie and back again, "just checking to see if you survived the storm." His tone made it clear that wasn't the real reason for his visit. He accepted a cup of coffee, his gaze sweeping over the sparse room, lingering on the children huddled by the fire. He turned his attention to Millie. "Mom," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy, "I'm sorry to bring up a painful subject, but I need to ask you about your husband, Caleb." Millie's stomach clenched. "What about him?" "His death was sudden," the sheriff continued, watching her reaction carefully. "The official report said he was caught in a rock slide while prospecting. But there were whispers, rumors that he'd gotten himself into some trouble." "My husband was a good man," Millie said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and anger. "I'm sure he was," the sheriff said smoothly, "but good men can make bad choices. There was a payroll robbery over in Carson County a few days before he died. A freight company was hit. $10,000 in gold coin. Gone. The strange thing is, your husband was seen in that area right around the same time." The implication was a slap in the face. He was accusing her dead husband of being a thief. "That's a lie," she breathed. The sheriff ignored her, turning his gaze on David. "A man with that kind of money could disappear. Or he could stash it somewhere before he had his accident. A desperate man's family might know where." The poison filled the room. The fragile trust that had just formed between Millie and David curdled. David looked at Millie, a question in his eyes. Was it possible? Was she hiding something? "The money was never found, McGrath," the sheriff said, standing up to leave. He clapped his hat on his head. "Just thought you should know who you're sharing your roof with. A man on his own is vulnerable, especially a man who's about to lose his land." He dropped that last bomb with casual cruelty. He paused at the door. "The bank's getting impatient, and I hear Clarabelle's husband is looking to expand his holdings." He left. The silence he left behind was a ringing void. The cut fence, the sheriff's concerns, Clarabelle's gossip. It was all connected. They weren't just trying to shame her. They were trying to drive a wedge between her and David. They wanted David's land, and they were using her, and the memory of her dead husband, as a weapon to get it. David wouldn't look at her. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. The sheriff had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was taking root. He had every reason to believe it. A desperate woman, a dead husband with a questionable past, a missing fortune. Millie felt the walls closing in. She had escaped the storm outside, only to be trapped in a much more dangerous one within. She looked at the man who had saved her and saw a stranger again. A stranger who now had 10,000 reasons to believe she was a liar and a thief. The days after the sheriff's visit were the coldest yet. The chill had nothing to do with the weather. It was a frost that had settled deep inside the house, crystallizing the air between Millie and David. He was polite but distant. The shared glance, the unspoken understanding, it was all gone, replaced by a wall of watchful suspicion. He never mentioned the stolen money, but he didn't have to. The question hung in every silence. It was there in the way he watched her, the way his eyes would sometimes drift to her meager belongings, as if wondering if a fortune in gold coin could be hidden inside a tattered cloth sack. Millie felt like a prisoner on trial. She knew she was innocent, but she had no way to prove it. Her husband was dead. Her past was a mystery to everyone here. All they had to go on were the poisonous lies spread by the sheriff and Clarabelle. The final straw came one afternoon when she saw David talking to Eli behind the barn. Her son stood stiff and proud, his small face a mixture of defiance and hurt. When David walked away, Eli ran to her, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. "He asked me," Eli choked out, his voice thick with outrage. "He asked me if Pa ever buried anything before he died, if he ever gave me a map." The accusation, now directed at her child, was a blade in Millie's heart. It was one thing to suspect her, a stranger, but to question her son, to try and turn him against the memory of his own father, that was a line she would not let him cross. That night, she made a decision. She waited until David was asleep. Then, in the dark, she gathered their few things: the worn-out blankets, the children's patched clothes. She would not stay here to be doubted. She would not let her son be interrogated. They had survived before David McGrath, and they would survive after him. They would take their chances with the cold. It was an honest enemy, at least. She was bundling their last quilt when a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around. David was standing in the doorway, fully dressed. He wasn't angry. He just looked tired. Tired in a way that seemed to settle in his very bones. "Don't," he said, his voice a low plea. "Don't go." "You think my husband was a thief," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. "You think I'm a liar. You questioned my son." "I was wrong," he said, and the simple admission seemed to cost him dearly. "I was wrong to listen to Hayes, wrong to doubt you." He took a step into the room. "The sheriff, Clarabelle's husband. They hold the note on this ranch. They've been trying to squeeze me out for a year. The cut fence, the rumors. It's all part of it. They want me to fail. They want this land." He looked at her, his eyes full of a weary resignation. "When you showed up, they saw a tool, a way to get to me, to make me seem unstable, foolish, to make the bank call in my loan." He finally confessed the whole truth. He was on the verge of losing everything. He wasn't just a grieving widower. He was a man fighting a losing battle against the powerful people in town. "I'm not asking you to stay for my sake," he said, his voice raw. "I'm asking you to stay for yours. If you walk out that door, you prove them right. You'll be a drifter, the thief's widow, running from the law. But if you stay, if we stand together, we might have a chance." He looked past her, at the sleeping children. They deserve a home. They deserve to be safe. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering an alliance, a partnership. Two broken people against a town full of vipers. It was a crazy, desperate gamble. But as Millie looked at her children, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, she knew it was the only choice she had. "What do we do?" she asked. A slow, determined light began to dawn in David's eyes. "We don't hide," he said. "We don't run. Tomorrow we're going into town, all of us. We're going to face them head on." The next morning, David loaded the wagon, not with firewood, but with people. Millie sat on the seat beside him, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. The children were bundled in the back. As they rode toward town, a silent understanding passed between them. They were heading into battle. The main street was busier than usual. It seemed the whole town had turned out. They stood in small groups, watching the wagon approach, their faces a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Clarabelle was standing on the porch of her inn, arms crossed, a smug smirk on her face. As the wagon drew near, she let her voice ring out, sharp and cruel for all to hear. "Well, look what the storm dragged in. I told you she was no good, didn't I? Warming McGrath's bed while hiding her dead husband's stolen gold." The word struck Millie like a physical blow. She flinched, her face burning with shame. June began to cry. Eli's hands clenched into fists. David pulled the wagon to a sharp halt right in front of the inn. The street fell silent. Every eye was on them. He didn't say a word. He just climbed down from the wagon, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a heavy, deliberate thud. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Clarabelle, forcing her to look up at him. He turned his head and addressed the entire street, his voice steady and powerful, rolling over the crowd like thunder. "Millie Harper is under my roof," he declared, "not as charity, and not in shame. She is a woman who has fought for her children with more strength and dignity than any of you have ever known." He let his gaze sweep over the crowd, meeting the eyes of the sheriff, who stood watching from his office porch. "She has kept my house, she has cared for her family, and she has brought more warmth and decency to my home than it has seen in 2 years. I will not stand here and listen to her name, or the name of her husband, be dragged through the mud by liars and gossips." Clarabelle's smirk faltered. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. David's shoulders squared. He stood taller, his presence dominating the street. Then he turned and looked directly at Millie, his eyes locking with hers, and in a voice that was clear, calm, and utterly final, he said the words that would change everything. "She will be my wife." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Millie's own breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth, her mind reeling. Eli's face broke into a grin of pure, fierce pride. This wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of war. He was drawing a line in the dirt and telling the whole town which side he was on. But before the shock could settle, Sheriff Hayes stepped off his porch, a grim look on his face. "A wedding won't change the facts, McGrath," he said, his voice carrying an official weight. "Caleb Harper was mixed up in something bad. There's no getting around that." "Is that so, Sheriff?" David challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is," Hayes insisted. "He was involved in that payroll robbery. It's a fact." A new voice suddenly cut through the tension, a reedy, nervous voice from the edge of the crowd. "That ain't true, Sheriff. That ain't what happened." All heads turned. A small, wiry man stepped forward, twisting his hat in his hands. He was one of the freight company guards, a man named Silas, known for being timid and easily frightened. "What did you say, Silas?" the sheriff demanded, his eyes narrowing. Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Millie, his eyes full of a pained guilt. "I was there," he said, his voice growing stronger, "when they hit the coach. There were two of them, but there was another man. He came out of nowhere, fought 'em. He was trying to stop them." A hush fell over the street. "That man," Silas continued, his gaze fixed on Millie, "he was your husband, ma'am. He wasn't one of the robbers. He was trying to help. They shot him. He died a hero." The truth, when it finally came, was a thunderclap. Caleb Harper wasn't a thief. He was a hero. "Why didn't you say anything, Silas?" David asked, his voice low. Silas wouldn't look at the sheriff. "Sheriff Hayes told me to keep my mouth shut. He said the freight company didn't want the story getting out. Said it was better for everyone if folks just thought Harper was one of the gang." Every eye in the crowd now turned on the sheriff. His face was pale, his authority crumbling before their very eyes. He had sacrificed a good man's name to protect a company's reputation. He had let a widow and her children be scorned, all to cover up the truth. Justice, it turned out, had finally found its way to this dusty street. David walked over to Clarabelle, who looked as if she'd swallowed a wasp. "I believe you owe this woman an apology." Clarabelle stood frozen, her face a mask of humiliated fury. David didn't wait for an answer. He walked back to the wagon and held out his hand to Millie. She took it, her fingers trembling, and stepped down onto the street. He kept her hand in his. Together, with their children gathered close, they faced the town. The whispers had stopped. The scornful looks were replaced with something new: respect. The sun broke through the grey winter clouds, spilling golden light across the snow. Millie looked at David, at this quiet, broken man who had just offered her everything: his name, his protection, his future. And she felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The bank still held the note on the ranch. Winter would come again. But for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid. She would never have to be alone again. As David helped her back into the wagon, he leaned in close and whispered, "Was that proposal too sudden?" A real smile, the first she'd felt in over a year, touched her lips. "I'll think about it," she whispered back. The children laughed in the back of the wagon as they turned for home. Millie glanced back one last time at the crossroads in the center of town, the place where so many lies had been told. Now it was the place where her new life had begun. They found their home not in a house, but in each other. A reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't what a person leaves behind, but the family you build together. What do you think was the biggest lie told in this story? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this tale of redemption on the frontier, Don't forget to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.